He showed up with nothing but a wrinkled photo in his jacket, and eyes that had seen too much war. His son stood on stage in full military dress, never expecting the man he hadn't spoken to in over a decade to be sitting quietly in the crowd. But when 2 guards tried to remove him, what happened next left the entire auditorium speechless. Why did 6 highly decorated Navy SEALs rise to his defense? And what truth had been buried beneath years of silence and pain? James Monroe hadn't worn his uniform in over 15 years, but that morning, as he looked in the cracked mirror of his run-down motel, he briefly considered pulling it out from the garment bag where it sat sealed in plastic. Instead, he chose plain clothes, a faded dress shirt and slacks that barely fit, because he didn't want to draw attention. He wasn't there to be seen. He just wanted to see his son, Ethan, one last time. The sun was barely up as James walked toward the prestigious Southridge Military Academy auditorium. The banners flapped crisply in the wind, proud and polished. Everyone arriving looked sharp, proud, and connected. James looked out of place. Parents hugged their sons and daughters, friends laughed and slapped each other's backs, but James stood alone near the rear exit, silent. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Ethan, tall, broad-shouldered, confident. James's throat tightened. He looked just like his mother. He slipped into a seat at the far back of the hall, hoping to blend in. He was already used to being invisible. Years of covert operations, years of not being home for birthdays or holidays, had trained him to fade into the background. The ceremony began. Names were called, medals awarded, applause rolled like waves. James never clapped. He only watched. His hands were trembling. Just before Ethan's name was called, James saw 2 men in black suits whispering near the door. They looked at him. Then one pointed. A moment later, the guards began walking directly toward him. James didn't panic. He'd seen worse in a dozen war zones. But there was something humiliating about it now, being approached like a threat at his own son's moment of triumph. The first guard leaned down. "Sir, we're going to need you to step outside." James looked at him. "I'm just here to watch," he replied calmly. The second guard glanced at his badge. "This is a secure facility, and you're not on the guest list. Please come with us." James didn't argue. He simply stood and nodded, holding back the fire in his gut. All around him, the polished families in front rows looked back, eyes narrowing. Some whispered. Some chuckled. James could feel the shame rising, but he kept his head down. Years ago, he might have barked back, made a scene. But that man was long gone. As he turned toward the exit, he paused and took one last look at the stage. Ethan was standing tall, ready to receive his officer's insignia. He didn't see James. Or maybe, he chose not to. James lowered his eyes and followed the guards toward the door. Behind him, a sudden voice cut through the air. "That man stays." Everyone turned. 6 men, all in formal Navy dress, had stood up in unison. Their presence wasn't loud, but it carried weight. They weren't just guests. They were SEALs. Decorated. Recognized. And by the way they stood, the message was clear: this wasn't up for debate. James Monroe hadn't always been a ghost in his son's life. There was a time when little Ethan would run barefoot across the backyard just to jump into his arms. Those were the early days, before the deployments, before the classified missions, before silence filled the house more than laughter ever did. James had been a Navy SEAL with a spotless record and unmatched instincts. But his real mission, the one he failed, was at home. When Ethan was 5, James missed his first birthday. When he turned 7, James sent a card from Kandahar that arrived 3 months late. When Ethan turned 10, he stopped asking where his father was. That was the year James came home for 2 weeks and spent most of it locked in the basement with the shades drawn, jumping at every noise. By the time Ethan turned 14, he didn't even look up when his father called. And James eventually stopped calling. The love hadn't disappeared, it had just been buried under years of disappointment and hurt. James believed that his sacrifices overseas were noble, that one day Ethan would understand. But when James finally retired from active duty, the welcome home he dreamed of never came. His wife had moved on. Ethan had hardened. There were no balloons, no banners, just a pile of unopened letters and an address James wasn't supposed to visit. Still, he tried. He showed up to a high school football game once, stood at the edge of the field under the bleachers just to watch Ethan play. The boy looked like a warrior, fast, strong, and determined. But when James tried to approach him after the game, Ethan turned away without a word. James remembered standing in that parking lot long after everyone had left, staring at the empty field, trying to remember how to breathe through the pain. For a while, James kept sending letters. He wrote about sunsets in Somalia, freezing nights in Norway, the smell of dust in Afghanistan. But none of them were answered. One Christmas, he wrapped a compass in a small box and left it at Ethan's school front office, with a note that read, "So you never lose your way." He never knew if it was opened. Years passed. The beard grew. The medals gathered dust. The silence deepened. And James, who had faced down armed enemies in the dead of night, found himself terrified of one teenage boy's rejection. But something changed 6 months ago. A letter arrived. No name, no return address. Just a date and location, June 3rd, Southridge Military Academy. Graduation ceremony. There was no signature. No invitation. But James knew what it meant. He read it a dozen times under a desk lamp, hands trembling. Had Ethan changed his mind? Did he want him there? Or was it a mistake? James didn't care. He packed his bag and left that same night, traveling over 1,200 miles by bus, stopping only to sleep and eat cheap roadside food. He rehearsed what he'd say if they met again. He even bought a second-hand suit jacket from a thrift store just to look halfway presentable. Still, a part of him didn't believe he'd be welcomed. He kept thinking about the last time he heard Ethan's voice, shouting from the top of the stairs, "Don't come back here." That was 6 years ago. And it still echoed in James's mind every night. By the time he arrived at Southridge, his heart felt heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried. As he sat in that auditorium, he wasn't just hoping to see his son graduate. He was hoping for redemption. He wasn't sure if Ethan had changed, or if he even remembered the face of the man who had let him down over and over. But James couldn't miss this. Not this. If it was a trap for disappointment, he was ready. If Ethan turned away again, he'd accept it. He didn't come to demand forgiveness. He came to witness a moment he never thought he'd be allowed to see. Even if it meant sitting at the back, unnoticed, like a stranger. Even if it meant being escorted out like a trespasser. He came because despite everything, he was still Ethan's father. And deep down, some part of him still believed that mattered. James had spent the night in a cheap motel just outside of town, the kind with flickering signs and thin walls. He didn't sleep much. He kept staring at the folded invitation on the nightstand, wondering if it was really meant for him. As dawn broke, he stood in front of the mirror and tried to smooth the wrinkles out of his shirt, hands shaking slightly. He clipped his old watch onto his wrist, the same one he'd worn on his first deployment. It didn't work anymore, but it reminded him of who he used to be. The air was cool when he stepped outside, and he walked to the academy gates with a slow, steady pace. The campus was buzzing with families, proud cadets in polished boots, and photographers capturing perfect moments. James stayed on the edges, unnoticed, like a ghost drifting through memories. He didn't bring a camera or wear a name tag. He just wanted to see Ethan walk across that stage, even if it meant seeing him from the shadows. The Southridge Auditorium was massive, filled with long rows of clean chairs and shining floors. Patriotic music played softly from the speakers. Flags hung with perfect folds, and officers walked the aisles with practiced smiles. James found a seat in the back row and sat quietly, folding his hands in his lap. He glanced around, taking in the polished shoes, the pressed uniforms, the perfectly rehearsed pride. It had been years since he was around this kind of formality. But now, stripped of his own titles and medals, he was just another face in the crowd. He watched parents beam as their sons and daughters lined up backstage, watched children wave tiny flags and grandparents dab their eyes. But no one looked at him. A tall man in uniform stood on the stage and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a booming voice, "welcome to the Southridge Military Academy graduation ceremony." The crowd applauded. The lights dimmed slightly. James sat still, heart pounding. Ethan was somewhere backstage, and James was minutes away from seeing him. But as the speaker continued his welcome speech, James felt eyes on him. He turned slightly. 2 security guards were whispering near the main doors. One of them was pointing. A ripple of discomfort ran through James's chest. He looked down at his lap, then forward again, willing the moment to pass. But it didn't. The 2 guards began walking down the aisle toward him. James sat upright. They weren't running, but their path was direct. When they reached him, one leaned in politely but firmly. "Sir," he said, "can we speak with you for a moment?" James didn't answer right away. "Just here for the ceremony," he said after a second. The guard nodded. "You're not listed on the official guest registry. We've had reports of someone fitting your description entering without credentials." James almost smiled. Even now, he was still being treated like an intruder. The second guard added, "We'll have to ask you to come with us." For a brief second, James thought about pushing back. About showing them his old Navy SEAL ID, or explaining that he'd been invited, kind of. But something in him stopped. The fight had left him years ago. He stood up slowly, not wanting to cause a scene. As he rose, whispers traveled through the rows around him. A few guests turned to stare. A woman tilted her head and muttered something to the man beside her. A teenage boy in front of him chuckled under his breath. James felt the heat of shame crawl up his neck, but he said nothing. He just nodded to the guards and started walking up the aisle. The speaker on stage continued, unaware. Names were being read now. Applause echoed. But as James reached the edge of the auditorium, just steps from the exit, something strange happened. A voice from the middle rows called out sharply, "That man's not leaving." It cut through the air like a knife. Everyone turned. James stopped walking. The guards froze. In the middle of the room, a man in dress blues had risen from his seat. He wasn't alone. 5 others stood beside him, one after the other, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn. James's breath caught in his chest. These weren't random guests. These were SEALs. Younger than him, but instantly recognizable by the way they held themselves. Warriors. One of them stepped forward slightly, then spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "That man saved my life in Kandahar. He doesn't move unless he wants to." The room went silent. The guards hesitated, unsure of what to do. James stood still, his hands loose at his sides, eyes locked on the 6 men now standing between him and disgrace. Slowly, people began to murmur. Some leaned over to ask questions. A man with a camera lowered it, confused. The mood in the room shifted. The guards looked at each other, then back at James. "Is this true?" one asked quietly. James said nothing. He didn't need to. One of the SEALs stepped closer. "You'll show him some respect." The tension in the room was thick now. James felt frozen in place, caught between wanting to leave and wanting to collapse. The memories rushed back, dusty roads, radio calls, nights spent lying in silence hoping the sun would rise. These 6 men were pieces of those memories. Pieces he had buried. And now they stood for him when no one else would. Slowly, James turned to look toward the stage. Ethan had come out, standing among the other cadets, holding his head high. But for a moment, their eyes met. Ethan blinked, confused. He hadn't expected this. James saw it clearly. His son hadn't expected him to show up. And now, with the whole room watching, he didn't know how to react. The silence that followed the SEAL's voice was deep and unnerving. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from a lack of sound, but from the weight of something unexpected hitting the room like a stone in still water. Everyone turned their heads, unsure of what they had just heard. These men in uniform weren't guests or proud relatives. They were soldiers, hardened and respected, standing shoulder to shoulder in defense of a man who had almost been escorted out like a trespasser. James remained near the aisle, frozen mid-step, unsure if he was dreaming. The guards beside him didn't move either. Their posture changed. They weren't holding him anymore. They were simply standing near him, waiting, eyes shifting between him and the row of SEALs now staring straight ahead. The one who had spoken, a tall man with a clean-shaven jaw and sharp eyes, stepped into the aisle. "Commander Monroe," he said in a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the auditorium, "you're not leaving. Not today." At that moment, a ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. A few guests sat up straighter. Some whispered. Others just stared. The title wasn't one thrown around lightly. Commander wasn't casual. And when said with that kind of authority, it landed like a gavel. James finally turned toward the man who had spoken, and for the first time, a small flicker of emotion crossed his usually unreadable face. He knew that voice. It had once cried out in pain during a mission gone wrong in the mountains of Helmand Province. And James had dragged him, bleeding and unconscious, across 2 miles of enemy terrain to safety. That man now stood in full dress, a symbol of strength, vouching for him in front of strangers who had judged him just by his clothes. One by one, each of the 6 SEALs stepped into the aisle. The second, shorter and more rugged, said calmly, "This man taught us how to survive. We're standing here today because of him." The third added, "He led us through missions we weren't supposed to come back from." Then the fourth, his voice softer, simply said, "He's the reason I got to hug my daughter last Christmas." The fifth and sixth nodded in agreement, offering no words, just a silent show of support. Their presence changed everything. The tone in the auditorium shifted. People no longer looked at James like a problem. They looked at him like a question. A mystery. Who was this man they had judged so quickly? The guards took a step back, no longer escorting but observing. One even whispered an apology under his breath. James didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the group of men now standing in a protective line. They weren't trying to cause a scene. They weren't here for drama. They were here for truth. One of them turned to the audience and added, "You all came here to celebrate men of honor. That man is the reason some of us even lived long enough to graduate." The tension in the room released like a held breath. A few people clapped, unsure of what else to do. But it wasn't the loud applause of celebration. It was the hesitant clap of shame, the kind that follows realizing you misjudged someone too quickly. Near the stage, Ethan stood perfectly still. His hands were stiff at his sides. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were wide. He had no idea any of this would happen. And now, with hundreds of eyes watching, he saw his father not as the man who had missed birthdays or broken promises, but as someone revered by men he clearly respected. It challenged everything he had told himself for years. These weren't random soldiers. These were his own peers, his comrades, fellow officers in training who were now calling his father a hero in front of everyone. James didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was tight, and the weight of the moment sat on his chest like a stone. He had been ready to walk out quietly, to vanish again without asking for anything. He never expected this. Not the support. Not the honor. Not the public praise from men who owed him nothing. Slowly, one of the SEALs walked down the aisle and placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You've done enough walking away," he said quietly. "You belong here." It was the first kind thing anyone had said to James in a long time, and it shattered something inside him. He nodded once, slowly, and stepped back into the row he had been forced to leave. This time, no one questioned it. The audience stayed quiet as he sat back down. On stage, the announcer hesitated, unsure whether to continue. But after a moment, he cleared his throat and returned to the list of names. The ceremony resumed, but the air was different now. Everyone was alert. Everyone was thinking. There were no more snickers or whispers. James's presence had been transformed. Where there was judgment, there was now respect. Where there was silence, there was now curiosity. But perhaps most importantly, there was a single pair of eyes still locked on him, Ethan's, trying to reconcile the image of the absent father he thought he knew with the man these warriors had just defended. James sat motionless, back in his seat, but the atmosphere around him had shifted completely. The same people who had scoffed and whispered now looked at him with curious eyes, some even ashamed. The 6 Navy SEALs returned to their seats, but their message had been delivered. James wasn't just some old man sneaking into a graduation, he was someone worth standing up for. The stage lights dimmed slightly as the ceremony continued, names read aloud in a respectful tone. But for James, none of the sounds around him mattered. His focus was on the young man in uniform standing among the rows of cadets. Ethan wasn't clapping anymore. He wasn't smiling. He was staring. A long, fixed look of confusion and something else, maybe realization, maybe disbelief. James didn't move. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, knuckles white. The ghosts of years lost danced quietly in his mind. He remembered every missed call, every unopened letter, every birthday where he drank alone wondering what his son looked like now. There was a deep ache in him that never fully healed. Even when he was doing missions that most men wouldn't survive, he would think of Ethan. Sometimes in the dead of night, lying in a muddy trench or a remote safe house, he would pull out the photo he kept in his boot. A photo of Ethan at 4 years old, missing a front tooth, wearing a pirate costume. That photo had been soaked in rain, sweat, even blood, but it stayed with him through everything. It was the one thing he protected more than his own life. But none of those things were visible now. Not the photo, not the pain, not the sacrifices. All Ethan had ever seen was the empty seat at the table, the broken promises, the man who didn't show up. James didn't blame him. How could he? He'd chosen duty over family too many times. Even after retiring, he didn't know how to come back. What would he say? What could he possibly offer to fix years of absence? So he kept away, hoping time would ease the wounds, not realizing they were only getting deeper. But when he received that unsigned letter, part of him lit up again. Maybe it was Ethan reaching out. Maybe not. But it was enough. Enough to make him buy a bus ticket. Enough to make him try. On stage, cadets were starting to receive their medals. Each name brought polite applause. James looked down at the program he'd picked up earlier. Ethan Monroe was listed third from the end. He ran his finger over the name, feeling the letters like they were sacred. The announcer kept reading. The crowd watched proudly. But James could feel something heavier creeping in. All those years of silence were pressing down on both of them now, filling the space between father and son like a wall too high to climb. Suddenly, James heard movement beside him. One of the SEALs leaned in and whispered something he didn't expect. "He used to talk about you, you know. Not often. But it wasn't all bad." James didn't turn his head. He kept staring forward. "When we first met, he was angry," said his old man walked out. But during training, he started asking questions. He found out things. Stuff you did. And after that, he got quiet. Focused. "I think he was trying to figure out who you really were." James clenched his jaw. It was hard to hear, but harder not to. The SEAL added, "I think he's been trying to hate you for a long time. But it never really stuck." James exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. That small truth hit harder than any blast he'd ever faced. There was still something left. Some thread not yet cut. On stage, the names continued. Ethan's row began to move forward, each cadet taking their turn. James leaned forward slightly, not blinking. Ethan stepped forward in line, shoulders squared. The announcer called his name. "Cadet Ethan Monroe." The crowd clapped, louder than before, maybe out of respect, maybe out of tension. Ethan walked across the stage, perfect in form, expression unreadable. But when he reached the middle, he paused. Just for a second. His eyes scanned the crowd, quickly, as if looking for something. Then he accepted his medal, shook hands, and stepped aside. James swallowed hard. He didn't know if Ethan had seen him. But the pause meant something. He knew it did. Then, unexpectedly, one of the SEALs stood again. And then another. And then all 6. They didn't speak this time. They simply turned to James, placed their right hands over their hearts, and gave a nod of deep respect. It wasn't showy. It wasn't loud. But it was impossible to ignore. One by one, more people started standing. A ripple moved through the audience like a wave. Parents, cadets, faculty. Some stood unsure. Others stood with clear intent. No applause. Just silence. And James, sitting there with his hands folded, felt something crack inside him. He didn't cry. He couldn't. But the tightness in his chest was unbearable. He looked at the SEALs, then at the crowd, then finally, at Ethan. Their eyes met again. And this time, Ethan didn't look away. He just stared, as if seeing his father for the very first time. Not the man who had missed everything, but the man who had carried everything. The final names were called, the medals handed out, and the ceremony reached its end. The announcer thanked the families and staff, the students tossed their caps in the air, and a wave of excitement broke through the formality like sunlight after a storm. People stood to clap and cheer, some rushing forward to hug their children, others taking photos or making their way to the reception area. But James stayed seated. He didn't move. The 6 SEALs who had stood up for him earlier remained nearby, keeping their eyes on the stage. James's gaze never left Ethan. The auditorium buzzed with joy, but a thick layer of quiet tension still lingered between father and son, as if everything had been said without either of them speaking. Ethan stepped down from the stage slowly, his polished shoes landing with precision. He wasn't smiling like the others. He wasn't laughing or posing for photos. He was walking with purpose, straight toward the aisle, his eyes locked on one person. James rose instinctively, unsure what would happen next. For a brief moment, they stood face to face, no more than a few feet apart, surrounded by a sea of strangers who had no idea what this moment meant. James didn't speak. Neither did Ethan. The silence was louder than the celebration. The years between them seemed to stretch and close at the same time. All the anger, confusion, and pain hovered in the air, but something else was there too, something harder to define. Understanding. Maybe even forgiveness. Then, without a word, Ethan did something no one expected. He straightened his posture, took one small step back, and raised his right hand in a sharp, perfect salute. It wasn't a casual gesture. It wasn't out of obligation. It was a salute given with the full weight of what it meant: respect, recognition, and something deeper. A tear welled in James's eye, but he didn't let it fall. He didn't return the salute right away. He just stood there, stunned, caught between the man he used to be and the father he had always wanted to become. The room began to quiet as people noticed. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. Heads turned. Ethan held the salute. His hand didn't shake. His eyes didn't wander. James slowly raised his hand, returning the gesture, not as a former officer, but as a man trying to show his son everything he couldn't say out loud. When he finally dropped his hand, Ethan did the same. But instead of walking away, Ethan stepped forward and reached into his pocket. He pulled out something small, square, and worn. He handed it to James without saying a word. James looked down. It was the compass. The same one he had left at the school office all those years ago. The one with the note that said, "So you never lose your way." James's fingers closed around it slowly, like he couldn't believe it was real. The edges were scuffed. The lid was scratched. But it had been kept. All this time. Before he could speak, Ethan said quietly, "I kept it in my locker. Every single day." His voice didn't shake, but it was soft, raw. James's throat closed. He had no words. None that would mean enough. So he just nodded, swallowing hard, the weight of years pressing behind his eyes. The moment ended without a hug, without tears, without a big dramatic scene. But it was real. Strong. Enough. They stood for a moment longer, and then Ethan turned to join his classmates. But before walking away, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "You were late," he said. "But you showed up." James gave the faintest smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but said everything. Ethan nodded, then disappeared into the crowd. As the crowd thinned and families spilled out into the reception hall, James stood alone again. But this time, the weight on his shoulders felt different. Lighter. Not gone, but shifted. He reached into his pocket and held the compass tight. The 6 SEALs passed by and gave him quiet nods of respect, no longer bodyguards, just witnesses to something rare. One of them whispered, "That was something to see." James said nothing. He just watched the door where Ethan had left. He turned to leave, but then stopped just before stepping outside. He looked back at the now half-empty auditorium. All the rows of chairs. The flags. The stage. The room where everything changed. It had started with shame. And it ended with a salute. Not everything was fixed. There were still conversations to have, memories to unpack, wounds to heal. But it was a beginning. A real one. Outside, the sun was bright. The wind picked up slightly, lifting the flags at the entrance as families posed for pictures. James stepped down the stone stairs slowly, not in a rush anymore. As he walked toward the parking lot, he passed a woman who had been sitting in the row in front of him during the ceremony. She looked up and gave him a gentle smile. "That was your son, wasn't it?" she asked. James didn't stop walking. He just nodded. "Yes," he said. "That was my son." And as he walked away, the compass in his hand, the air felt different, clearer. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking away from something. He was walking toward it.